She was 41 years old, widowed, penniless, and standing at the edge of a town that had already decided she didn't belong in it. It was her husband's own brother, Silas Coe, who put her out, claiming the freight business, the house and every last mule in the yard as his by-blood, and leaving her with nothing but a carpet bag and $14 sewn into the hem of her traveling skirt. She had walked 3 days to reach the town of Ochre Flat, Arizona Territory, in the spring of 1889, and there, at a county tax auction nobody else cared to attend, she paid $9 of those $14 for a collapsing, sand-choked ruin the auctioneer could barely be bothered to describe. The old blind mule saloon, boarded shut for 11 years, its sign hanging by one nail, its name a local joke. "Take it," the auctioneer said, laughing. "Nobody wants it." She took it anyway because a fool with a roof is still better off than a wise woman without one. What she did not know, what no living soul in Ochre Flat still remembered, was that beneath the warped floorboards of that worthless saloon lay a sealed room that would not only save her life, but would force an entire town to remember who it truly belonged to, and to whom it owed a debt 11 years and far older than that. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Verity Coe. If you have ever been told that what you carry has no value, that you yourself have been written off as easily as an old building boarded shut and forgotten, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. Verity had not always been a woman with nothing. She had been raised on a modest wheat farm outside Independence, Missouri, the second of 4 daughters born to a German immigrant father and a mother whose own mother had been born enslaved in Kentucky and had bought her freedom. Thread by thread, working as a seamstress until she had saved enough to purchase herself and, later, her daughter. That grandmother, whom Verity had known only through a handful of summers before the old woman passed, had taught her one thing above all else, repeated so often it had become scripture in the small house, that nothing owned outright, however small, however plain, was ever truly worthless, because ownership was the one thing no one could then simply take from you without a fight, and a fight was something worth having. Verity had grown up watching her grandmother's hands, spotted with age but never idle, turning scraps of fabric other women threw away into quilts so fine that ladies from 3 counties over commissioned them. "Everyone wants pretty things," her grandmother used to say, guiding Verity's small fingers over a needle, but the woman who can see worth in what others have discarded, she is the one who never truly goes hungry. Verity carried that lesson the way other women carried scripture, and it shaped her into someone who noticed things. The good bones under a sagging roof, the strong grain beneath a smoke-blackened beam, the honest face behind a nervous one. She married young, at 19, to a freight hauler named Thomas Coe, a broad, quiet, decent man who ran wagons between Missouri and the territories with his younger brother Silas at his side. Thomas had none of his brother's hunger for more land, more money, more standing, and it was that very steadiness that had drawn Verity to him in the first place, after a childhood spent watching her own father worry the family into an early grave chasing bigger harvests he never got. Thomas and Verity built a modest but honest life together over 18 years, moving the freight business slowly westward as the railroads pushed the frontier further, settling finally in a rented yard on the outskirts of a growing cattle town in the Arizona Territory. They had no children, a private sorrow Verity rarely spoke of even to herself, but she poured what mothering instinct she had into the business itself, keeping its books with the same careful attention her grandmother had once given a him, knowing every debt owed and every debt due down to the penny, knowing which drivers could be trusted with a late payment and which could not, knowing, in short, the true worth of everything that passed through her hands even when the men around her did not. It was this very competence, ironically, that had made Silas resent her long before Thomas ever took ill. Silas Coe was a man who believed worth flowed only in one direction, toward himself, and he had never forgiven his brother for marrying a woman sharper with figures than he was, nor forgiven Verity for correcting him gently but firmly, on more than one occasion when he'd tried to skim a little extra off a haul. When the influenza took Thomas in the winter of 1888, quick and cruel, Verity buried her husband on a Tuesday and by the following Monday, found herself standing in the freight yard listening to Silas explain, not unkindly but not kindly either, that the business had always been a Coe business, that there was no paper naming her as anything but a wife, and that a widow with no children and no blood claim had no true place in it. He did not throw her into the street with cruelty in his voice. He simply informed her as one might inform an employee whose services were no longer required, and then he had two of his drivers carry her trunk to the road. She had $14 sewn into her hem because she had, out of the same instinct that made her keep good books, always kept a little something hidden from every household expense, a habit her grandmother would have approved of and one that, in the end, was the only reason she did not starve. She did not weep in front of Silas. She waited until she was 3 miles down the road, sitting on her trunk in the shade of a mesquite tree, before she allowed herself that. And then she did what her grandmother's granddaughter was bred to do. She dried her eyes, counted what little she had, and began walking toward whatever town lay next, because sitting still had never once solved a problem in the whole history of the world, and she saw no reason to test that theory now. Ochre Flat was not much of a town when Verity Coe walked into it, a scattering of adobe and clapboard buildings clinging to the banks of a shallow river that ran dry more months than it flowed. A church with a bell nobody rang anymore, a general store, a livery, and streets more dust than road. But it had a rail spur newly extended to it, and rail spurs meant growth and growth. Verity reasoned with the same cool calculation she'd once applied to freight manifests. Meant opportunity for anyone patient enough to plant a flag before the rush arrived. She had almost nothing left to plant a flag with. $5 remained after 2 nights in the town's cheapest boarding house and a week of careful, half-portioned meals. And it was with those $5 clutched in her glove that she wandered, more out of curiosity than intention, into the shade of the county courthouse steps on a Thursday morning to watch a tax auction she had no business attending. The auctioneer, a sun-cured man named Otis Reddy, was moving through a short list of delinquent properties with the bored efficiency of a man who'd rather be at his supper. Most parcels drew no bids at all. Scrubland, a collapsed well house, a burned-out smithy, until he reached the last item on his list and gave a short, dry laugh before he even read the description aloud. Blind Mule Saloon, he said. On 2nd Street, 11 years vacant. Counties had it condemned since the Wilkerson fire scare. Structure's sound enough, they tell me, but nobody's touched it on account of the talk. Verity asked the woman beside her, an older widow named Mrs. Agatha Prue who ran the boarding house Verity was staying in, what talk that might be. And Mrs. Prue only pursed her lips and said that folks in Ochre Flat had long believed the old saloon was unlucky, that something had happened there once, long before her own time, that nobody quite wanted to speak of and nobody quite could forget either. It was, Mrs. Prue said, the kind of building a town simply stops seeing after a while, the way you stop seeing a scar on your own hand. When Otis Reddy called for a bid of $9 back taxes owed and got only silence, he shrugged, said, "Take it. Nobody wants it," in the same tone he might have used to give away a busted wagon wheel. And Verity, before she had entirely finished thinking the thought through, raised her hand. She told herself, walking the 2 blocks to 2nd Street with the deed folded in her glove and her whole fortune reduced now to $5 minus 9, that she had done it purely from practicality. A roof, however cursed, was still a roof, and she had learned as a girl that a woman with an address was treated altogether differently than a woman without one. But some smaller, quieter part of her, the part shaped by a grandmother who'd taught her to see worth where others saw only trash, whispered that there was something else at work too. Some old instinct she couldn't quite name pulling her toward that sagging, sun-bleached building the way a compass needle pulls toward north, whether or not the one holding it understands why. The Blind Mule Saloon. When she finally pried the boards from its door and stepped inside for the first time, smelled of dust, dry rot, and something faintly mineral like a cellar or a cave. Sunlight came through gaps in the roof in long golden shafts, illuminating a floor thick with the drifted sand of 11 Arizona summers, an overturned bar with its brass rail still gleaming dully beneath the grime, and shelves stripped bare except for a single unbroken bottle, its label long since dissolved to nothing. It was by any honest measure a ruin. But Verity walked its length slowly, the way she used to walk a freight yard checking a haul for damage, running her palm along the bar's edge and finding, beneath the dust, wood so dense and well-grained it must have been hauled in at great expense from somewhere far away, and floorboards that, when she knelt and pressed her hand flat against them, felt unusually solid and unusually cool for a building sitting atop desert sand. It was that coolness more than anything that made her pause. A structure built directly on sand should have held the day's heat, not resisted it. She thought of her grandmother's hands teaching her to feel for the good cloth hidden inside a pile of rags, and she began that very first afternoon to search. It took her 3 days of careful, unhurried work, clearing debris, testing boards, listening for the particular hollow note a floor makes over empty space rather than solid earth, before she found it, a section of flooring near the old bar's footrail that gave, ever so slightly under pressure, its boards cut not with the rough haste of the rest of the saloon's construction, but with the deliberate, hidden precision of a man who wanted something both accessible and unseen. Beneath it, when she finally pried the boards loose with a borrowed crowbar and her own trembling hands, was not a crawl space or a root cellar of the ordinary kind, but a narrow set of stone steps descending into darkness, dry and cool and undisturbed, exhaling a breath of air that smelled of old paper and older secrets, air that had not moved, she was certain, in a very long time. She did not go down that first day. She sat instead at the top of the steps as the light failed outside, her lantern unlit in her lap, and felt something she had not felt since her grandmother died, the particular, prickling certainty that she was standing at the edge of something that mattered, not just to her but to more people than herself. When she finally descended the next morning, lantern raised, her breath fogging faintly in air far cooler than the desert above, she found herself in a small dry stone chamber, its walls lined not with barrels or bottles as she had half expected of a saloon cellar, but with shelving, and upon the shelving, wrapped in oiled canvas that had preserved them remarkably against the passing decades, books, ledgers, ranks of them, alongside bundles of letters tied with cord gone brittle, and at the center of the room, resting on a small table as though someone had set it down meaning to return for it and simply never had, a single leather-bound volume far older and finer than the rest, its cover embossed with a name that meant nothing to Verity yet but would, within days, mean everything to the town above her head. Temperance Ashworth, Founding Register, Ochre Flat, 1861. Verity carried that first ledger up into the daylight with hands that would not quite stop trembling, and she read, by the fading gold of that evening's light, a history the town of Ochre Flat had entirely forgotten it once possessed. Temperance Ashworth, the register revealed in a strong, careful hand, had been a freed black woman who, together with her husband Solomon and a small band of freedmen families and Mexican vaquero families displaced by the border wars, had come to that stretch of dry river valley in 1861, a full decade before the town's official histories claimed anyone had settled there at all, and had built, plank by plank and stone by stone, a trading post, a well, a school for the community's children, and the very saloon that now stood, decades later, condemned and forgotten, above the room where its founder's own records had been hidden away. The ledger recorded land claims filed and witnessed for nearly 40 families. It recorded a shared fund, painstakingly built dollar by silver dollar through years of honest trade, set aside explicitly in Temperance's own careful hand, for a church and schoolhouse to serve all children of this settlement, that none among us be raised in ignorance for want of what we ourselves were once denied. And then, abruptly in an entry dated the autumn of 1871, the ledger's careful record turned frightened, its handwriting hurried and uneven where it had once been steady, describing the arrival of a land speculator named Colonel Josiah Pruitt, who came with money, with lawyers, and eventually with armed men, claiming the entire valley under a federal survey grant that Temperance's final entries insisted, in increasingly desperate language, was fraudulent. Forged, she wrote, with the same certainty of a woman who had once bought her own freedom and knew precisely what a false document looked like beside a true one. The register ended mid-sentence. There was no account of what became of Temperance Ashworth, of Solomon, of the 40 families, of the church that was never built, of the money that had vanished from every official town record as though it, and the people who saved it, had simply never existed. Verity sat with that ledger through the whole of that night, and understood with a clarity that settled over her like cold water, that she was holding not merely a curiosity, but a wrong that had never been righted, and that the town living comfortably atop that wrong had no idea, not one soul among them, that its true founders had been erased from its own memory as completely as if they had never drawn breath. She thought of her grandmother, bought free by her own hand, written out of nothing because she had made certain she never could be. She thought of Silas Coe, standing in that freight yard, informing her she had no paper proving her claim to anything, and she understood, sitting alone in a condemned saloon with a dead woman's ledger in her lap, exactly what she was meant to do with what she had found. She did not act rashly. She spent the following weeks quietly cross-referencing the ledger's entries against county land records at the courthouse, working the same patient, meticulous method her years of freight bookkeeping had trained into her, and what she found confirmed every fear the dying pages of Temperance's register had hinted at. The valley's official founding deed, filed in 1872 under the name of one Colonel Josiah Pruitt, bore a survey date suspiciously close to the very autumn Temperance's writing had turned frantic, and a witnessing signature belonging to a county clerk who, further digging revealed, had been dismissed from his post the following year under a cloud never publicly explained. More damning still, tucked among the bundled letters in that hidden cellar, Verity found correspondence between Temperance and a Tucson attorney, half-finished, describing threats made against the settlement and a promise, in the attorney's own returning hand, to file the community's original claims for permanent protection. A filing that, according to every courthouse record Verity could locate, had never actually occurred, as though it had been intercepted, or its filer paid to look the other way, or worse. What made the discovery all the more urgent was a name Verity recognized on the current town council roster: Bartholomew Pruitt, grandson of the very colonel, now the largest landholder in Ochre Flat and the man whose family fortune, Verity now understood with a chill, had been built quite literally atop the erased lives of Temperance Ashworth's people. It was Bartholomew Pruitt who owned the bank, who sat on the school board, who had, in fact, been the loudest voice on the county council years earlier, arguing that the old Blind Mule Saloon should simply be torn down rather than sold, though nothing had ever come of that argument until Verity herself had bought it out from under the town's indifference for $9. Word travels quickly in a small town, and it was not long before Bartholomew Pruitt himself came calling at the saloon, dressed in a fine gray coat entirely wrong for the desert heat, offering Verity what he called a generous sum, $200, an enormous fortune to a woman who had arrived in Ochre Flat with 14, to sign the property back over to the county for the town's own good, he said, his smile never quite reaching eyes that kept flicking, again and again, toward the floorboards near the bar, as though he already suspected, or perhaps had always known, precisely what lay beneath them. Verity, who had spent 18 years learning to read a man's true meaning beneath his polite words, understood at once that this was no charitable offer, but a man trying to buy silence before silence became impossible to purchase. And she told him, with the same calm steadiness she'd once used to correct Silas Coe over a misfigured hall, that she would need time to consider it. She did not need time. She needed allies, and she set about finding them with the same quiet patience she'd once used to court new freight clients, seeking out first Mrs. Agatha Prue, whose own grandmother, it turned out, had once spoken in hushed tones of a settlement that vanished from the valley long before Mrs. Prue's own family arrived. Then an elderly Mexican rancher named Esteban Ruiz, whose family had farmed the valley's eastern edge for 3 generations, and whose own grandfather, he now recalled with a widening, astonished expression, had once mentioned a vaquero family named Reyes, who'd simply disappeared from the valley the same autumn. By local legend that the trouble happened, and finally a young schoolteacher named Louisa Bright, whose position on the school board made her one of the few people in town with both the standing and the conscience to help Verity bring the ledger's contents before the public rather than let Bartholomew Pruitt quietly bury them a second time. Together, working through nights lit by lamp oil Verity could scarcely afford, they cross-checked names from Temperance's register against county birth, death, and land records going back 3 decades, and found scattered across Arizona and into California the living descendants of at least 6 of the original 40 families, among them, astonishingly, a Reyes granddaughter running a modest but respected hotel in Tucson, and a great-grandson of Solomon Ashworth himself, a blacksmith named Ezra Ashworth, working not 80 miles away in Tombstone, entirely unaware that his own family's name had once been carved into the founding stones of a town that had erased them from its history. Bartholomew Pruitt did not surrender his family's version of events easily. When Verity, with Louisa Bright's careful help, brought the ledger and its supporting documents before a special session of the town council that summer, Pruitt rose immediately to declare the whole matter a fraud, a widow's desperate scheme cooked up to extort money from decent, established families, and he brought with him his own attorney and a stack of papers meant to muddy the clarity of Temperance's careful hand with a fog of legal delay. He reminded the council pointedly that Verity Coe was a woman with no standing in the town, no family here, no husband, nothing but a condemned building she'd bought for pocket change. Words that landed on Verity with an old, familiar sting, the very echo of what Silas Coe had once told her in that freight yard. But this time Verity was not alone, and she was not without proof. Esteban Ruiz stood to confirm the Reyes family's disappearance as living local memory passed through his own grandfather. Mrs. Prue offered her own grandmother's whispered stories as testimony, and Louisa Bright produced from the Tucson attorney's own surviving correspondence a copy in the attorney's hand describing threats made explicitly by agents of Colonel Pruitt against the settlement, evidence that could not be so easily dismissed as an outsider woman's invention, because it bore in ink over 20 years dry the Pruitt name itself. The council session grew heated, and for a time it seemed the matter might be tabled indefinitely under the weight of Pruitt family influence and the county's general reluctance to reopen old wounds it had spent decades comfortably forgetting. But it was in the end a simple discovery that turned the tide. One final item Verity had saved from the cellar, not a ledger or a letter, but a small, sealed strongbox found tucked behind the shelving, its lock long rusted through, containing the remains of Temperance Ashworth's community fund itself. Silver dollars, dulled with age but entirely genuine, along with a final scrap of paper in Temperance's own hand, dated the very night, it seemed, before whatever violence or threat finally drove the settlement from the valley, reading simply, "Should this be found by other hands than ours, let it still build what we intended, for our children if not for us." Verity read those words aloud to the council chamber in a voice that did not waver, and there was not a soul in that room, not even Bartholomew Pruitt himself, who could meet her eyes when she finished. What followed was not swift, and it was not without further struggle. Pruitt's attorneys delayed and appealed and muttered darkly about statutes of limitation for many weeks more. But the weight of evidence, once public, proved impossible to bury a second time. The county, under pressure from a territorial newspaper that picked up the story and ran it beneath the headline, "Town's Buried Founders Found at Last," commissioned an independent review of the original 872 survey and found, precisely as Temperance's frightened final entries had warned, Clear evidence of forgery in the witnessing signatures. Bartholomew Pruitt did not go to prison. The men who might have truly answered for that old crime were 40 years in their graves. But he lost. In the settlement that followed, both the moral standing he'd spent his life presuming and a substantial portion of the very land his grandfather had stolen. Land that was returned in shares determined by Temperance's own careful register. To the descendants Verity and her small band of allies had spent that summer tracking down. Ezra Ashworth, the blacksmith from Tombstone, stood in the dust of 2nd Street the day the settlement was announced, and wept openly at the sight of his great-grandfather's name, finally spoken aloud in the town his family had built and been erased from. Verity Coe used none of Temperance Ashworth's silver for herself, though the council, chastened, offered her a portion of it as finder's reward. She asked instead that every dollar of the old fund, along with a portion of the settlement money returned by the Pruitt estate, go toward exactly what Temperance had intended it for all those decades before. A schoolhouse, built at last on the empty lot beside the old dry well, open to every child in Ochre Flat regardless of family name or family history, and a small church beside it, its cornerstone laid.